Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about a trespassing neighbor. I've never liked conflict, but life lately has been so crazy that I feel like I'm in a drama. I moved to a quiet neighborhood a few months ago. After moving from a busy city to the suburbs, I needed a quieter environment. My property was mostly attractive for its yard, a large garden with a broken-down greenhouse, a small orchard with fruit trees, and a quiet stone path through tall hedges. My house needed work, but I was ready for a new start. However, something felt off when I started renovating. The neighbors were friendly, but Merrick, let's call him Merrick, kept appearing in my yard like a ghost. I initially ignored it. I assumed he was curious or overly friendly, greeting the newcomer on the block. It was strange to see him walk through my garden at odd times. Trespassing, as if the boundary lines didn't exist, was involved. Merrick and I spoke briefly one late afternoon. I was crouched behind tall grass and hedges fixing a leaky water line next to the outdoor spigot. He entered my garden without knocking or yelling because he didn't know I was there. I was surprised and annoyed when I stood up abruptly with a muddy wrench and saw him staring at an old bird bath I was restoring with intense curiosity. I coughed to introduce myself. He turned around, eyes wide, stammered, "Just looking," and ran off. That should have been my first warning sign. Over the weeks, I cleaned up the garden, picked up yard debris, cut back wild brambles, and tended to the orchard. That orchard had 2 apple trees, 1 peach tree, and a healthy fence-line grapevine. I wanted to fix an old, half-collapsed greenhouse near the orchard. I found fresh footprints in the soft soil near the greenhouse every day. I occasionally found non-mined snapped branches or footprints near the orchard. I can tell human shoe prints from animal tracks, so it wasn't just wildlife. I decided to take a more direct approach and installed a "No Trespassing" sign at the Fence Street intersection of my property. A few smaller signs were also placed in the backyard. To be thorough, I added a post and rope wooden barrier to the orchard's entrance. I saw the rope unravel several times over the next few days. I saw footprints from the orchard to the greenhouse again. An entire apple tree branch was stripped clean one day, and I noticed fruit missing. It looked like someone had rummaged, taken what they wanted, and left. A week later, I spoke with my neighbor across the street, Gideon. Gideon, a quiet, middle-aged man, liked afternoon porch reading. He admitted to seeing Merrick walk through my orchard like a park several times. Gideon shrugged, adding that Merrick seemed to believe in a common right to the orchard because the previous owner rarely complained. Gideon noted that the old homeowner chose that. Merrick wasn't exempt now. I was furious. I tried to think rationally. I politely wrote that I was uncomfortable with uninvited guests on my property and would like a conversation before anyone entered. I slipped the note under Merrick's door at night to start a conversation. I received no response after days. I found more of him in my yard. Frustration increased. The final straw was when I woke up one Sunday morning and saw a small patch of carefully prepared soil at the back corner that I'd tilled for a flower bed completely ruined. It appeared someone had run over it or left large footprints. My gardening tools, carefully placed on a bench, were scattered. One spade was half buried in the grass, and my favorite hand trowel was missing. Angered, I checked the fence. The wire fence near the orchard had a new tear, as if someone had pushed through or cut the wiring. Absolutely no more nonsense. I left the "No Trespassing" signs and wooden barriers for a reason, but they could have been decorations. Merrick had lost his respect for boundaries. I placed non-lethal deterrent traps in key areas of my yard after researching. My plan was simple. Nor did I want to hurt anyone or an innocent animal. I wanted to frighten the intruder and make it uncomfortable for them to stay. I double-checked local laws to ensure my rights. According to my research, posting signs indicating that traps were present for pest control were allowed as long as they were non-lethal and not maliciously designed to harm humans. I set up triggers to make loud noises or harmless but startling effects, like a whiff of pepper spray or a net that flapped and made a racket. I strategically placed them near the greenhouse and orchard entrance, including some by the fence line where the break occurred. I upgraded my camera system to catch trespassers. The fun started quickly. An evening yard clang startled me. I ran outside with a flashlight and saw one of my deterrents go off. The place was empty, but I heard footsteps running away. Perfect proof the intruder was frightened. The next morning, I reviewed my recordings. Merrick was seen walking around the orchard 30 minutes after sunset. He stepped right on a trigger, which made a loud metallic clatter to deter large pests or deer. It wasn't dangerous, but he must have been scared. He fled quickly. This gave me some satisfaction. I didn't like using these methods, I wouldn't have cared if Merrick had asked permission or respected my boundaries. I wanted to make sure he understood since that wasn't his goal. Over 2 weeks, I occasionally checked my cameras and found no visitors. I planted flowers in the new bed while the orchard's fruit remained. It appeared everything would settle, but I seriously underestimated Merrick's audacity. I saw him lurking near the fence line while working on my greenhouse late one afternoon, replacing shattered glass panes, reinforcing the wood structure, and installing new racks. He probably checked for traps. I shouted, "Merrick, this time. You have no business on my property." He was unapologetic. He snapped, "You can't stop me from walking around here." Old owner cared nothing. "Your orchard is almost a public resource." I lost all sympathy for him. I repeated that he should leave my land unless he wanted me to file a complaint. He scoffed. "We'll see who has the last word." A bizarre event occurred a few days after that hostile exchange. One evening, as I cleaned up from planting, I heard shouting from the orchard. Merrick, of all people, was standing near one of my trap signs, hollering. I dropped my tools and ran over. He must have trespassed again, missed the sign, and fallen into one of the new net traps. This net trap was designed to fling up from the ground with a loud rattling noise to capture stray animals without harm. His feet and lower legs were partially entangled. Dirt on his knees suggests he fell forward. Merrick went crazy when he saw me. "This is illegal. You set traps. You'll be arrested." Though my voice shook with anger, I tried to stay calm. "You're trespassing." He yelled nonsense about how this was a criminal setup, turning red in the face. I explained that I had consulted local regulations and that my actions were meant to deter intruders, animal or human, from my orchard. The net was startling, but it wouldn't break bones or cause permanent damage. In anger, Merrick called the police immediately. I rolled my eyes. Nearly wanted to see how that conversation went. He admitted to entering my property without permission. Merrick continued screaming at me about how I would pay for this, as if his threats would intimidate me while entangled in the net. "Fine, let's wait for the officers," I said, recording everything on my phone and calmly explaining that I was on my private property, which was clearly posted against trespassing, and that the intruder had triggered a legal, non-lethal deterrent. Merrick raged. Trying to escape only made him trip again. I gave him garden shears to carefully release his foot. I warned him that cutting too hard could hurt him. He stood up unsteadily after freeing his feet. He stayed until the officers arrived because "I'm going to see you get in trouble." A patrol car with 2 officers arrived 20 minutes later. I immediately recognized Officer Davis, who had stopped by to introduce himself as part of a neighborhood watch initiative. I didn't know Officer Bradley, a woman. Merrick started screaming about how I had set a dangerous trap on my property and that he would file assault charges. He demanded my arrest. Officer Davis signaled Merrick to slow. He calmly approached the orchard entrance signs. "I can see multiple clearly worded signs," he said. Merrick ignored the warning that this property is posted for no trespassing and warns that pest traps are in use, insisting that setting a net trap could harm someone. Officer Bradley asked me about the trap, so I explained that it's a net that could tangle someone, but it doesn't have sharp edges or injurious wires. Wildlife rescue teams use the same method to safely capture stray animals. That trap was without spikes or chemicals and within local guidelines. At that, Officer Davis pulled Merrick aside and asked pointed questions. "Were you allowed on this property?" Merrick dodged by saying the previous owner never cared. Officer Davis insisted, "That's irrelevant. Did the new owner say you could enter whenever?" Merrick hesitated, then said, "No, but I have a right to enjoy the orchard. I've done it for years." Both officers looked exasperated. He sounded like a toddler demanding a toy someone else owned. After listening quietly, Officer Bradley informed Merrick that trespassing is illegal and that ignoring posted signs or direct warnings does not excuse it. Merrick replied, "But you can't set traps that injure people on your property." Officer Davis asked if Merrick was hurt. He was bruised lightly, no wounds or breaks. Clearly, this net trap only entangled and humiliated him. As intended, it physically deterred an intruder without harming them. Officer Davis turned to me and asked for my version, which sealed the deal. I explained how I had caught Merrick trespassing multiple times, posted no trespassing signs, and spoken to him in person to tell him not to wander. I also had past camera footage. I also checked with a local attorney about non-lethal trap laws to ensure compliance with state and county laws. Officer Bradley nodded, confirming that property protection applied to traps that weren't hidden. malicious devices meant to injure or kill. They told me there might be more complicated legal issues if someone was severely injured, but Merrick only had minor bruises. Merrick doubled down. He demanded police cite me. He made a scene by asking, "Are you incompetent?" He cannot have free rein to build contraptions. That was enough for Officer Davis. "Sir, you admitted trespassing, you had warnings, you activated a legal device on his property. If you press charges, we can investigate fully. But you might find yourself in more trouble than you think." Merrick did not speak. He was then asked to step aside so the officers could talk to me privately. My goal was not to escalate. I just wanted Merrick off my property. After our conversation, the officers said I could press charges. They also suggested a restraining order if Merrick kept bothering me. They proved I was right based on the signs, traps, and repeated warnings. Merrick stood with arms crossed, fuming. Officer Bradley approached him, gave him a trespassing citation, and warned him that if he returned to my property without permission, the consequences would be worse. Merrick complained and threatened to hire a lawyer, but the officers said it was his choice and wouldn't change the facts. It suited him, in my opinion. How often must you tell someone to leave your land? I hoped that was it. I was relieved when Merrick left after the officers cited him. I thought his arrogance wouldn't disappear overnight. A few days later, I photographed him glaring at my house from the sidewalk. Instead of entering, he looked like a hawk watching prey. Despite my frustration, I decided to ignore him as long as he didn't enter my property. Meanwhile, life went on. I was excited to start a small herb garden in the greenhouse and sell the produce at the farmer's market. To increase pollination, I set up some beehives on the orchard's other side. Beekeeping was my new hobby, but I had read about it. I was busy preparing, ordering gear, and building frames. I kept an eye out for trespassers, especially Merrick, as the orchard grew. One subplot involved my friend Lila, who occasionally helped me with the orchard. Pollinator-friendly gardens were her passion as an environmental consultant. Lila suggested installing a motion-activated sprinkler system for extra deterrence. Simple concept. If something or someone passed the sensors, they got a harmless but surprising water jet. It was ideal because it wouldn't hurt anyone, but would alert any intruder, raccoon, or unscrupulous neighbor. Gideon, the helpful neighbor across the street, enjoyed the show. He witnessed Merrick's random sidewalk stare-downs. After the evening news or browsing his mailbox, Gideon saw Merrick grumbling to himself. Merrick may have been furious about the citation. Gideon warned me Merrick might complain to the homeowners association, but our small neighborhood's association was lax, focusing on shared services like street cleaning. I followed local ordinances so they wouldn't care about my orchard or greenhouse. My orchard grew over time. My newly planted flowers bloomed, the beehives were nearly ready, and the greenhouse no longer looked run down. I felt accomplished and proud. My security measures helped too. My cameras captured nighttime raccoons and opossums sniffing around, startled by the sprinklers, and fleeing. No sign of Merrick entering the yard. I almost thought we had reached an unspoken truce, that the citation had woken him up to the fact that the orchard wasn't public property. A few weeks later, Merrick's attorney sent me a letter, shattering that illusion. Merrick was considering suing me for unnecessary endangerment after my traps injured him and caused him emotional distress, according to the short letter. I nearly laughed out loud while reading it. Feeling down? For entering another's property, ignoring warnings, and getting caught in a net that bruised him? Sounds ridiculous. However, I took the letter to a local attorney I had consulted before for security. He wasn't anxious. He said that without evidence of malicious intent or severe harm, it would be difficult to prove in court, especially since the police had already cleared me. He advised me to keep all my camera footage, signage receipts, and evidence that Merrick knew he was trespassing. If Merrick sued, we'd be ready. Gideon also told me that Merrick was bragging to two neighbors about how he would make me pay and teach me a lesson, which strengthened my resolve. I wouldn't allow bullying on my property. Even though my orchard was small, it was my sanctuary and I had worked hard to restore it. I wouldn't give up because a neighbor wanted free fruit and space. I feared a lawsuit for 2 more weeks. I continued gardening, but I was always annoyed and stressed by the possibility of defending myself in court. My attorney called me unexpectedly to say Merrick had dropped the suit. My attorney thought Merrick's lawyer told him it was a losing proposition, or he lost his nerve. Still, it was a small but satisfying win. Merrick's vengeance persisted. Taking a break in the orchard, I read a book under an apple tree one weekend afternoon. The yard was peaceful. I watched the bees leisurely fly from flower to flower, thinking how lucky I was to have found my peace. Then an angry voice broke the silence. Merrick was staring at me from outside my fence with folded arms. He went on about how I had turned the neighborhood into a war zone, setting traps, installing cameras, and drenching everyone with sprinklers, exaggerating. Keeping quiet, I didn't respond. I said calmly, "You have no right to come in here. Please leave me." His temper exploded. "Not worthy of this orchard. You're fortifying it. If you can't share, don't live here." He listed almost comical grievances. That was when something shocking happened. Rosalind, a neighbor I only knew briefly, came by after a walk and overheard Merrick's outburst. In my place, she told Merrick, "Stop harassing people on their own property." Merrick turned beet red but stomped away, realizing he was outnumbered. I thanked Rosalind for helping. She said Merrick's odd behavior toward me started when I moved in. She apologized for not speaking up sooner, but thought ignoring him might be best. He seemed to be escalating the situation, which worried her. I told her I had everything on camera and would call the police if Merrick did anything else. Days went by without conflict. I started more vegetable seedlings and arranged them in rows in my greenhouse. I also built a taller, stronger fence around the orchard with a lockable gate. I refused to let Merrick's petty behavior stop me from enjoying my property. It was his prerogative to admire it from afar, but no more. I received a security camera notification on my phone while mowing the lawn near the orchard one fateful afternoon. I was at the far corner of the property when motion sensors detected activity around the orchard's entrance. I turned off the lawnmower and viewed my phone's camera feed, curious. My jaw dropped. Merrick jumped over the orchard partial fence. I rushed there, heart racing. This came after the citations, near lawsuit, and repeated warnings. I was furious. I shouted, "What are you doing?" As I approached, Merrick looked startled and half-panicked. Of all things, he was fiddling near one of my new beehives. A bad idea because bees don't like interference with their home. The phone camera was rolling. Merrick sputtered, I just wanted to see what you were hiding in here." As if on cue, 2 bees flew around him, likely sensing his disruption. The panicked man fell backward. He smashed a hive box with his elbow in haste, then a small cloud of agitated bees appeared. Merrick panicked and swatted. I retreated to avoid being stung, but I felt sorry for him as he panicked. His mess was entirely his own. You shouldn't poke a beehive, not while trespassing on someone else's land. "Get out of here, run!" He ran toward the orchard exit, but the gate was locked. He tried scaling the fence in a rage, which was hilarious. He got over it and fell, likely with many stings. If anything, I felt bad for my bees. They were protecting their hive. I used my gentle smoker to calm the bees when I checked on the hive. My heart raced and hands shook. That man hopped the fence and touched a beehive. I was appalled. I could have shown him how they worked if he had approached me civilly and expressed curiosity. After all his nonsense, he strangely decided to sabotage or inspect them to catch me breaking a rule. I called non-emergency police immediately, explained the situation, and gave them my footage. By now, the local precinct knew about Merrick and my neighborly conflict. An officer arrived within 30 minutes, recognized the address, and asked, "Him again?" The officer examined my footage of Merrick scaling my fence and messing with the hive. After taking my statement, the officer went to Merrick's house and knocked. Gideon, on his porch, watched the scene like a live show. I saw Merrick handcuffed and led out to the driveway shortly after. I didn't know if he was arrested or detained, but from my orchard, it looked like the officers were done with his nonsense. The officer later confirmed the report, saying they were processing him for criminal trespassing and possibly reckless endangerment of my property. The officer also advised the district attorney to charge Merrick for property damage because he upset the beehive and endangered the colony. It ended Merrick's misdeeds. Word spread throughout the neighborhood over several days. Some neutral or unaware people approached me with supportive comments or questions about the feud. Though I wasn't seeking revenge, Merrick's repeated disrespect for boundaries had worn me down. Let him face real consequences if necessary. Merrick's arrest caused a few minor issues. One night, someone left a bag of rotting fruit near my trash bins. Petty intimidation? I threw it and checked my cameras. The video was inconclusive, but I thought it was Merrick's friend or relative. It didn't escalate after that. My orchard thrived more than ever. Bees returned to pollinate flower beds and orchards. After rebuilding my greenhouse, I grew tomatoes, peppers, and other vegetables. Lila and I spent weekends experimenting with organic gardening methods, excited about a small farmer's market stall next season. Gideon occasionally stopped by to chat and tell me local gossip. Merrick had a hearing a month away, and the judge could fine him heavily or put him in county jail for his repeated trespassing and property violations. I was subpoenaed to testify in Merrick's criminal trespass case 5 weeks later. I was nervous about court testimony, but my documentation was ready. Time-stamped video, no trespassing signs, trap installation receipts, and police statements were available. Gideon offered to testify because he'd seen Merrick's brazenness. The lawyer who sent me the initial threatening letter did not represent Merrick at the hearing, possibly because he realized he was a lost cause. The hearing was simple. The prosecution showed that Merrick had been warned to stay off my property, had been cited, and was caught on camera trespassing again, resulting in him tampering with my beehive. I calmly testified that I needed to protect my property and safety, not Merrick. Merrick's lawyer tried to argue that my orchard was free to the community before I moved in, and that I was unfairly restricting access. The judge disagreed, stating that private property was private. Merrick was found guilty of criminal trespass and fined heavily. On my behalf, the judge granted a protective order against Merrick, which would increase penalties if he returned to my land. Merrick looked pale. He muttered something, but the court staff calmed him and told him to act civilly. I left the courthouse lighter. I won my property defense case after all the chaos. I didn't want to set up traps or a fortress, but Merrick's trespassing and disrespect for boundaries forced me to. Without my intervention, he would have trampled my orchard, stolen fruit, messed with my greenhouse, and who knows what else. He might have destroyed my beehives if he thought they were a nuisance. Life settled down slowly. My orchard produced apples and peaches, and my grapevines yielded enough grapes for juice. The bees settled, and I got my first jar of fresh honey. My greenhouse was full of fresh produce. Merrick didn't appear after the hearing. Rumors suggested he was staying with a relative in another part of town, or was too embarrassed to show his face. Merrick's house eventually had a real estate sign out front, indicating he was selling, Gideon said. It wouldn't hurt to lose him. In an odd twist, a couple of neighbors told me that some community members liked that I revitalized the orchard and made it a roadside landmark. Neighborhood kids and their parents walked by with their parents, excited to see the well-kept rows of vegetables and fruit trees. If I was working, they waved. I usually gave them fresh fruit or a small bouquet if they asked politely. Respectful neighborliness was fine with me. I only wanted to keep a peaceful, private property and share bits with polite visitors. I liked the story's small addition. The local horticultural society wrote to invite me to their annual garden tour a month after the hearing. They loved how I rebuilt the greenhouse and created a pollinator-friendly environment. They even mentioned the orchard's history. A famous horticulturist planted it decades ago. I nearly laughed out loud remembering Merrick running around the orchard like public land. If he had been nice, we could have restored the orchard for community events. His antagonistic approach only led to legal issues and embarrassment. Merrick's imaginary personal injury claims never cost me a dime. My lawyer confirmed that the lawsuit threat was phony. I kept my security cameras, traps, and motion-activated sprinklers, but I adjusted some for practicality. After that fateful day with Merrick, the net trap was moved to a more discreet area prone to raccoon intrusions. But ironically, no human trespasser set it off again. I still get along with Gideon. He frequently dropped off lemonade while I worked in the greenhouse. His favorite part was beekeeping. It was like watching a mini nature documentary. Lila advised me on sustainable gardening and fruit selection for my orchard. We considered planting plum trees or berry bushes next season to attract pollinators. The orchard was my refuge, and I was grateful every day for sticking to my guns. I believe some people will trample your property rights if you don't. I never wanted conflict, but sometimes you have to act. In this bizarre story, I followed local laws and installed non-lethal traps, which got Merrick into his worst situation, but it was his own doing. If someone says no, respect that boundary, is my moral. Keep pushing and don't complain when you get caught in a net, literally or figuratively. Merrick is gone, so the neighborhood is quiet. The new family in his old house is polite, friendly, and respectful, unlike Merrick. On their moving day, they introduced themselves and said they were looking forward to quiet, friendly neighbors. I almost told them the drama, but I decided to keep it a secret. Gideon or Rosalind would likely inform the curious. The orchard is a peaceful, thriving nature spot in our small community for now. If anyone thinks they can sneak in, the signs and traps are there for a reason. Friends, thank you. See you soon.